Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's talk consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Choi, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
Well, I'm doing great today, too. Thanks for asking. And we'd like to thank you all for tuning in. Today on The Voice of Yoga, we will talk about the 4 major obstructions to enlightenment in the spiritual science of Kriya Yoga. Listen as we explain the operation of the metaphysical and mystical principles understood to exercise dominion over the illusion. In this show, we will explore the 4 directions and the meaning for the man, bull, lion, and eagle in Revelations. Welcome to The Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and experience genuine enthusiasm. So the title of today's show is Overcoming the Human Tendency to Laziness. Boy, it sounds like something we could probably all get a clue what that's all about. How can you help us with that?
In Kriya Yoga, we observe 4 major obstructions to enlightenment: fear, ignorance, selfishness, and laziness. I have something here which I took right from the website, www.ipdtransform.com/theory2. And I'll read it. You cannot lead someone to permanent change by doing for them what they must do themselves. Personal accountability and responsibility are the foundation of Kriya Yoga Theory 2. You must be engaged and devoted. Prana power brings virtue to overcome fear, wisdom to overcome ignorance, purpose to overcome selfishness, enthusiasm to overcome laziness. Kriya Yoga is a path of action, knowledge, and devotion. These sessions are a celestial positioning system to guide the individual into union with the divine. There are 4 elements. The 4 directions: north, south, east, west, fire, earth, air, water. And then, of course, we open all of this up into 4 mental functions: perception, reason, memory, intuition. 4 physical functions: strength, flexibility, balance or alignment, and endurance. The 4 obstructions that we mentioned to enlightenment: fear, ignorance, laziness, and selfishness. The corresponding attributes to overcome the obstructions are virtue, which corresponds with water, wisdom with air, enthusiasm with earth, and purpose with fire. Now, what we want to start to try and do is see how everything starts to lose its distinction as thought shifts from a mental material basis to a spiritual basis. We create this mental landscape in order for us to be able to rise into the one perfect divine life.
So what do you think happened to humankind collectively to put us in this state of laziness?
Yeah, what happens with this is we're kind of lulled into this state of satisfaction. The term that we use in Kriya Yoga is contentment. And whether we realize it or not, it is a hypnotic state. We are believing that we are in a finite mortal body, and we are accepting that. But to understand what motivates us, fear-based motivation is typically what generates any kind of activity for a human being. This infantile defense mechanism, we need approval. Nothing really moves us quicker than this fear of annihilation. What we have learned now is that that is a hypnotic state. It's a belief we are vulnerable. As your thought shifts from a mental material basis, which is driven and motivated by fear, you want to graduate into what we call this word enthusiasm, with theos. Enthusiasm is such a great visual for me because it means with the divine principle. I and the Father are one. To be in tandem with what is pure, powerful, sacred, omniscient is what is known as inspired. So there's a difference between motivation and inspiration in this model. And of course, it's very difficult to distinguish between it. What we say in our yoga class is you could be doing the exact same thing at a different level of consciousness and a different degree of awareness. So we don't judge by the appearance. But what we find is love is a much greater catalyst than fear on all levels. And I find it interesting how insightful Mrs. Eddy was and how she could use things like arsenic as a symbol to motivate, which breaks the inertia of fear, and then engage movement with inspiration.
So I'd like to just ask you a question about the concept of laziness. So when we hear laziness, I think some people think laziness just means not being able to get off the couch. But I think of it also as being lazy with the mind. And then how do we use this concept of this inspiration to maybe overcome that?
Yeah, see, what we're looking at here is a lot of laziness really can be associated with a depression. And depression is fear turned inward. Violence is that fear turned outward. But it's very immobilizing. And what we want to try and do is break that inertia. In material law, a body at rest requires a whole lot more energy to put in motion than a body in motion requires to keep in motion. Once you start to understand a little bit of the science of how all of this works, and then also what I really like coming back to Christian Science and the work that Gilbert Carpenter did in Mary Baker Eddy, Her Spiritual Footsteps, chapter 25, and I'll read it. The action of mortal belief can be roughly divided into three main heads, acting through matter, through mind without, and through mind within. In connection with arsenic, the first action would result from actually drinking a dose of it. The second would be where you felt effects in your body which you believe could be traced to suggestion or malpractice indulged in by others. The third would be where your own thought should become obsessed with the fear that would manifest itself as the symptoms of poison. In Christian Science, these three modes are really one based on false belief. End of quote. This is an important thing that we start to understand, this idea of going twain, translating everything back to spirit, back to the one. And then when spirit is cause, creation is perfect. This becomes a very important strategy you learn to enlist as a practical guide for highly effective living.
You explained a bit ago, enthusiasm overcomes laziness. Now, I know some people who are naturally enthusiastic. So if somebody doesn't have that natural quality, how do they go about becoming enthusiastic?
Well, sometimes we use words that don't really apply. Our original state of consciousness is we are excitable. And at your lowest level of consciousness, you never want to confuse the difference between enthusiasm, which is really only when one has rejoined with the divine principle. You can go from excitable to even ambitious, where you're intelligent and you are motivated based on the testimony of your corporeal senses or your sense of satisfaction and achievement from personal accomplishments. But enthusiasm is only there when you are in tandem with the divine principle. And you can only do that by accepting spiritual identity. It is in oneness when we are truly enthusiastic, where it is no longer my will, but thy will be done. And you can't have a personal sense of self with ambition and human goals and objectives and still be enthusiastic in the true sense of the word.
So we're talking about laziness, and you explained pretty well about the enthusiasm and the part that plays with it. What else can we learn from Christian Science that may help us with the concept of laziness and overcoming that?
To do this, we have something from Gilbert Carpenter, Mary Baker Eddy, her Spiritual Footsteps, where he mentions some of the obstacles in scientific thinking: human satisfaction, mental drunkenness, hypnotized into believing God is in control. And he wrote, and I'll read it, chapter 25. Mrs. Eddy used her teaching in regard to the handling of arsenic and animal magnetism in a similar way, calling from the students their immediate, aggressive, and finest spiritual endeavor. She knew that the human mind must be stirred to its highest point of activity in order that it may be thrown off and a spiritual activity take its place. She devised many ways to do this in order to draw from students the last ounce of effort needed. No one could criticize Mrs. Eddy's methods since they bore such glorious fruitage. She perceived the necessity of the student overcoming the human tendency to laziness, which otherwise might stupefy him into yielding to animal magnetism and its lies. She adopted a standard in her home so high that there were those who called it unnecessary fussiness. Nevertheless, she set the goal high intentionally so that it could be fulfilled only through demonstration. Such a move was spiritually wise because it brought forth from the students their best efforts and kept them on their toes. This fruitage was made manifest in their demonstrations. End of quote. What I find very interesting for me is the correlation between what we call process in Kriya Yoga, apotheosis, the process of the human becoming divine, which unfolds in 3 phases, where we go from unconscious awareness, where we're careless, emotional, excitable, and we graduate to self-conscious awareness, where we're humanly intelligent, ambitious, and then eventually to superconscious awareness, where we are wise, liberated, enthusiastic. Coming back to this enthusiasm, which is such an important visual to have, to be one with the divine creative principle, and then understanding what that would look like when you're doing it.
We're going to pause right here to hear a word from our sponsor. Listeners will be back with you in just a few moments. Kriya Yoga Theory 1, Human Development and the 8 Essential Stages of Kriya Yoga. This program is a comprehensive course that will help you get your arms around the science of Kriya Yoga. It provides a clear understanding of the goals and objectives behind yoga, along with the physics of spirituality. It includes the practices, supportive concepts of Kriya Yoga, and the process in human development, apotheosis, the process of the human becoming divine. a complete guide on how to become a human in the adult state. Get the light in your soul and experience the simplicity and joy of union with the divine. This course is available in live classes at the ashram or online with 8 videos or 4 CDs. Visit our website, www.ipdtransform.com, for more information. Welcome back. For those who are just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So I had a thought about that Gilbert Carpenter statement that you had read when you were saying Mary Baker Eddy adopted a standard so high in her home that people thought that it was unnecessary fussiness. I was wondering, is she creating discipline to create enthusiasm, to create a demonstration?
What we use in yoga, what surrounds you is within you. And faithful and orderly with the objects of sense is what's going to make us receptive to the deeper things of the divine principle. There is a progression that takes place. You could do the exact same thing at a different level of consciousness and a different degree of awareness. Say, for example, when we do mountain pose, you're doing a particular exercise that has very specific intention. You're working towards what we would call your highest understanding of right. To be able to stand with your bones supporting you internally and your muscles relaxed is an attainable goal for a human being. And every human being is different, but mountain pose is the same. The way everything is designed, that if the arch of the foot doesn't come up in exactly where it's designed to support the weight of the body, nothing stacks up. And so we learn mountain pose has a very specific outcome. But you could be standing with your bones supporting you internally and not be conscious of the divine principle. But the reverse of that is not true. You cannot be conscious of the divine principle and be standing with your bones out of alignment or synergy with your muscles. And so this is where you kind of working two ends against the middle. You use the physical body because it is the barometer. It is the monitor. Consciousness is experience. It's the diagram of what you are conscious of, but then it's not exactly foolproof, because what our goal here is this larger sense of self, spiritual identity, oneness with the divine principle, to be conscious of that truth. And it's not about the physical body, but you learn to use what you are experiencing in your corporeal sense reality to give you clues as to what you are conscious of.
And so to be conscious of that oneness, this is what we're talking about. We have these 4 obstructions that we have to become aware of and overcome them.
Right. And on many different levels. And even though that's not real, it's just all concepts and appearances and mental material energy, but it gives us something visible and tangible to corporeal sense to help us understand what is invisible and intangible to corporeal sense. And so we work with this highest understanding of right. In a similar way, you could ask the question, well, what about stimulating substances like caffeine to get things going? And here is where we can talk about the obstruction of ignorance. And to substantiate this point, we can use Gilbert Carpenter, Mary Baker Eddy, Her Spiritual Footsteps, 25 again. We have a soundbite.
These instructions bring up an important and interesting point in any effort to trace Mrs. Eddy's footsteps of thought, since this subject of arsenic appears time and time again in her history, as it did in her instructions to us. In the Lynn Reporter for June 23, 1882, she stated that her husband, Dr. Eddy, had died from arsenical poison mentally administered. She wrote, "Every symptom can be found in medical works as occurring from doses of arsenic." What is the answer to this phase of Mrs. Eddy's teaching, which has furnished her enemies with so much to scoff at? Metaphysics is science that treats of the mind. Yet, the only mind there is, in reality, is the divine mind, and the only science is spiritual science. In this science, the correct application is the effort to apply the divine mind to the so-called human mind as the human cause, and not to its grosser substratum, matter. In the realm of the human, mortal mind is that counterfeit of the divine mind, which assumes a despotic control over the individual mind to force it to whatever issues it desires. In this action, an important fact must be noted, namely, that the influence of this human mind is exercised largely through the grosser substratum called matter or symbol, the objects and substances of this material existence. The Roman Catholics use a beautiful statue of the Virgin Mary to act as a symbol or finger, pointing to the high spiritual ideal which she exemplified, but with the passing of time, the inherent tendency to idolatry in mortal man comes to the fore, and the ideal is lost sight of. In this manner, the lifeless symbol becomes endowed with spiritual qualities which rightly belong to mind alone, cause is lost in effect, and faith is hung on the object instead of the idea. This process is illustrative of how man has relinquished his divine rights of mind in every direction, delegating to shadow the prerogatives of substance, and then complaining at his loss of harmony and control over his destiny. An illustration of this point is the simple act of eating, where mortal mind attributes to matter, or shadow, the power to sustain man's life and strength, a power that belongs to mind alone. Herein is embodied the dominant error of mortal existence, that Mrs. Eddy corrects with the scientific statement of being on page 468 of Science and Health, which begins, "There is no life, truth, intelligence, nor substance in matter." If this statement should be applied to the case of the statue of the Virgin Mary, it would be the mental effort to withdraw from the lifeless symbol all sense of significance that had been read into it, and restore to the mental ideal that which, through ignorance, had been attributed to transient clay.
Here is when effect is mistaken as cause, which is the basis of the term ignorance, or avidya in Kriya Yoga, mistaking the impermanent for the permanent, or the biblical term sin, missing the mark. To prevent such a condition, Gilbert Carpenter talks about not letting the wisdom of truth get out of pace with the power of truth. He wrote in chapter 8 of this work, and I'll read it, "Man's demonstration of divine wisdom did not keep pace with his demonstration of divine power." End of quote. Inspiration and demonstration is recommended in this model. In the same way, one may read books about snowboarding and find themselves on a mountain, on a snowboard, unable to get down, because talk doesn't cook the rice. And until we are learning to apply the principle.
Swami, can we break down the phrases wisdom of truth, and what is the difference between that and power of truth?
Yeah, I think the way that we would break that down was, one is the letter of truth. To be able to academically, intellectually talk about the divine principle is the letter of truth, which is very valuable in order to teach divine science. You have to create an understanding of the principles and the application of the principles. But the power of truth is the spirit of truth. And the spirit of truth is not really something you can talk about. You'll find spirit is a demonstrable principle. It's a law. It testifies with deeds and not words. It's like James said, faith without works is dead. Until we are literally demonstrating divine law with scientific certainty, then we're typically still working with the mind that can't bring forth the divine image. And so as a result, it becomes very frustrating. And typically what happens is most people just take demonstration off the table. This is exactly what Mary Baker Eddy cautioned everybody about. Preaching without proving the presence of this divine principle is the demise of her cause.
Swami, can we talk about how the four directions and the meaning for the man, the bull, the lion, the eagle, and Revelations, what does that have to do with what we're talking about today?
Yeah, again, this is all about building the mental landscape to support the divine principle. You can't put an infinite mind in a finite form. And so this idea of having a proper sense of the infinite, the symbolism used in earlier times was found in the man, the bull, the lion, and the eagle, which is when you take the fixed signs of the zodiac and you put them on the angles with Scorpio rising. This symbolism was found in the Sphinx in Egypt, the head of the man, the body of the bull, the paws of the lion, the wings of a phoenix, which was the eagle-like bird out of its own ashes would regenerate. This was Scorpio. And of course, each one of these signs corresponds with an element. Scorpio is water, Leo is fire, Taurus is earth, and Aquarius is air. So as you're building your mental landscape to support this divine principle, to have this symbol for what we now call the body of Christ, the one body. It consists of the 7 personal planets, the 12 signs of the zodiac. This gives you a much larger sense of self to rise into, so that from that platform you can now invite divine mind, infinite mind into your consciousness, because you're not trying to bring it down to a finite form anymore. But again, this is all educating thought up to spiritual apprehension, and it's all about initiating this process that really begins with self-control, self-mastery. Your path of action are things that you can and you must do to employ strategies. And one of the reasons why you would enlist things like dietary recommendations, this idea of faithful and orderly with the objects of sense, and to what degree of intensity do you employ that? In this model, we start with skillful use of thought, knowing the difference between what we think we need and what we want gives you a way of distinguishing between reacting as if you're in danger when you don't get what you want, as opposed to reacting as if you're going to die if you don't get what you don't need. But it's a science. And the more that you enlist the strategies and you start to see the relativity of all of this, you can then start to see the advancement. Why would I want to have self-control and self-mastery only to give up a complete personal sense of self for this greater sense of self? But without it, you remain in this mortal sense of life, the cycle of death and rebirth. And you continue to be hypnotized and driven by a belief in 2 powers instead of experiencing the understanding of one perfect divine being.
That completes our show for today. Listeners, be sure to visit the website, www.ipdtransform.com. On any of the pages, as you scroll down, you'll see several buttons there that you can press to further your understanding. Swami, any final thoughts about today's program?
Well, I would like to encourage people to join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance, get the light in your soul, and experience genuine enthusiasm. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to our program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton, along with Swami Jayananda, signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga revelation. Namaste.